Fluorescent light, a wooden table, a folder my husband's attorney kept sliding closer to the judge, as if proximity could make his numbers true. "Mrs. Calloway," the judge said, "your husband's filing describes your financial position as unclear. Is that accurate?" "No, Your Honor." My voice didn't shake. I'd practiced not shaking for 3 months. Beside me, my attorney opened a binder thick enough to double as a doorstop. Across the aisle, Nathan sat with one ankle crossed over his knee, that same easy half-smile he'd worn since the day he filed. He leaned toward his lawyer and whispered something. His lawyer nodded, satisfied, the way men nod when they think they've already won. Behind him, his mother, Renata, sat with her hands folded primly in her lap, watching me the way she'd watched me for 11 years, like something that had wandered into her son's kitchen and refused to leave. The judge turned a page. According to the documents submitted by Mrs. Calloway's counsel, her verified net worth is approximately $28.7 million. Renata's folded hands came apart. Nathan stopped smiling. Somewhere behind me, someone inhaled sharply enough that I heard it over the hum of the ceiling lights. I kept my eyes on the judge because I had learned 3 months earlier that the only way to survive a man like Nathan was to never let him see your face change first. 6 weeks before that courtroom, I sat in a small law office in Savannah, Georgia, listening to an attorney read my late Aunt Corinne's will. Corinne had never married, never had children of her own, and spent 40 years running a modest antiques shop that most people assumed barely covered her rent. She drove a 15-year-old sedan. She darned her own cardigans. Nobody in the family thought of her as wealthy. They thought of her as frugal, maybe a little eccentric, the aunt who sent birthday cards with $2 bills tucked inside. My mother sat to my left, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. Nathan sat to my right, checking his watch every few minutes like the reading was cutting into something more important. The attorney, a soft-spoken woman named Priscilla Odom, adjusted her glasses and began listing bequests. A modest donation to the Historical Society, some jewelry to a cousin, the shop itself to a long-time employee, and the residual estate, Priscilla said, including all investment accounts, the commercial properties on Bull Street, and a family trust established 18 years ago. Passes entirely to Corinne's niece, Deanna, me. I looked up, certain I'd misheard. Priscilla continued reading numbers I couldn't fully process. Brokerage accounts. 3 commercial buildings downtown. Shares in a company Corinne had quietly invested in decades earlier when it was still a garage startup. My aunt hadn't simply left me money. She'd left me control of an empire she'd built in total silence, one nobody had ever suspected existed. My throat tightened. Why didn't she ever tell me? Priscilla gave a small knowing smile. Corinne once told me that people change the moment they learn what you're worth. She wanted you to be loved for who you were before that happened. I didn't understand the weight of that sentence yet. I would soon enough, starting with Nathan, who leaned over the moment we stepped outside and asked quietly, "So how much are we talking?" "We do not as you." I noticed it even then, though I didn't let myself think too hard about it. "I don't know exactly," I told him. "There's a trust. We're meeting again next week to go over details." He nodded slowly. And something crossed his face I hadn't seen before. Not happiness for me, not curiosity about my grief. Calculation, a man doing arithmetic behind his eyes. That night he was unusually attentive. He made dinner. He asked about my day twice. And right before bed, almost offhandedly, he said, "We should probably start thinking about how to structure things. Legally, I mean. For tax purposes." I told him we had time. He said we didn't, not really, not with numbers like that. I should have paid more attention to how quickly my inheritance became our liability to manage. 10 days later, I flew to Chicago to surprise him during a work trip. His idea of romance had always run cold, and I wanted, foolishly, to prove that his indifference hadn't rubbed off on me. I checked into a hotel 2 blocks from his conference, planning to meet him for dinner after his last session. I saw him in the restaurant lobby before he saw me. He wasn't alone. A woman in a grey blazer stood close enough that her shoulder brushed his arm when she laughed at something he'd said. "Are you sure she won't fight you on it?" the woman asked. Nathan smiled the way he used to smile at me. She doesn't have the resources to fight me. Not once the divorce is filed. Divorce. The word landed like a dropped glass and I froze behind a support column, my heart hammering somewhere near my throat. And the inheritance. The woman pressed. Once we're separated, discovery will force her to disclose everything. My lawyer already thinks we can argue commingling if we play it right. He glanced around, oblivious to how close I stood. I've already had a consultation. I stood there long enough to hear him plan the unraveling of an 11-year marriage, the way other men plan a merger. Then I turned around, walked back to my hotel, and didn't sleep. I flew home the next morning without telling him I'd been there. My hands didn't stop trembling until the plane landed. That evening I called Priscilla. She picked up on the second ring. "Deanna, what's wrong?" I told her everything. The restaurant, the whispered arithmetic, the word commingling spoken like a chess move. She was quiet for a long moment. "Don't confront him," she finally said. "Not yet. If he's already preparing legally, we need to understand exactly what he's done before he knows that you know." "How do I do that without lying to him every single day?" "You simply stop volunteering information," she said. "Silence isn't dishonesty, Deanna. It's self-preservation." The following week, papers arrived at the house. Nathan hadn't even waited to have the conversation with me directly. A process server handed me an envelope on my own porch, while my coffee went cold on the kitchen counter behind me. The petition cited irreconcilable differences and requested a temporary restraining order on what it called potentially undisclosed marital assets. He was accusing me of hiding money while he'd been quietly building a legal strategy around my inheritance. For weeks, I called Priscilla, hands shaking around the phone. "He's calling me the secretive one." "Expected," she said, unbothered. "Bring me everything you have. Every document he's ever asked you to sign." That night, after Nathan left for what he called a work thing, I went through old filing cabinets and a shoebox of forgotten paperwork in the closet. I found refinancing documents from 3 years earlier that I'd signed without reading closely, at his insistence because I trusted him. I found a form granting him secondary access to an investment account I barely used. Small things at the time. Now they read like reconnaissance. I photographed everything and sent it to Priscilla. Her response came 20 minutes later. "Do not discuss these with Nathan." Not one word. The next conference happened in Priscilla's downtown office, sunlight cutting sharp lines across the table. She slid a folder toward me before we started. "This concerns me." Inside was an email, forwarded from a financial institution, sent by someone representing Nathan 2 days before my aunt's will was even read. It requested information on how a family trust of undetermined size might be valued during a future divorce proceeding. 2 days before, I repeated, staring at the timestamp. How could he possibly know? "That," Priscilla said, "is what we intend to find out." Nathan came home early that afternoon, laptop already open at the kitchen island, wearing the cardigan I'd bought him for his birthday. For one unguarded second, the sight of him nearly cracked something in my chest. This was still the man who'd held my hand through my father's funeral, who'd slept beside me for over a decade. "Hey," he said, glancing up, "did you talk to your lawyer?" "About what?" "The estate." He closed the laptop halfway. "Why are you being so cagey about this?" "We're married, Deanna." That sentence once would have comforted me. Now it sounded like a lever being pulled. "I don't know much yet," I said. "You don't have to hide things from me." I almost laughed at how strange that sentence sounded. 3 days after hearing him plot my finances beside a stranger in a Chicago restaurant. I said nothing. He sighed, stood, and walked away, and that was the night I started. Locking documents in a fireproof safe in the garage, and the first tangible sign that my marriage had quietly become a negotiation I hadn't agreed to. Enter. Weeks passed in a slow accumulation of evidence. Priscilla's investigators uncovered a paper trail Nathan had clearly assumed would stay buried. Emails to his attorney, speculating that, if the trust is as large as I think, we should move before she understands what she's entitled to. Messages from his mother, Renata, urging him not to let that woman walk away with everything Corinne left behind, as though my aunt's inheritance were a shared family resource rather than a gift specifically addressed to me. I read Renata's message twice, feeling something in my chest go cold and still. In 11 years, she had never once asked how I was coping with my aunt's death. She had asked almost immediately about property. She understood enough to discuss dividing assets that were never legally yours, I said quietly. Nobody at the table had a response to that. The conference ended without resolution, but something had already shifted. Nathan could no longer walk into the real hearing as the wronged husband blindsided by a secretive wife. He had built himself a paper trail, and that paper trail was now speaking louder than he could. The hearing itself unfolded the way these things do, slowly, then all at once. Nathan's attorney argued for disclosure. Priscilla produced the trust documents, the property records, the appraisals, over $28.7 million in verified assets, structured entirely outside our marriage, established by a woman who had spent her life making sure no one would ever see it coming. The judge read the number aloud. Renata rose halfway from her seat, went pale and had to be steadied by the bailiff before she sat back down, visibly shaken. Nathan stared at me with an expression that wasn't anger. It was something closer to grief for a future he'd already spent in his imagination. "You never told me," he said afterward. In the hallway, his voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. "You never asked how I was doing," I said. "You asked what I was worth." He didn't have an answer for that. Nobody ever does, once the arithmetic stops working in their favor. In the months that followed, I did something my aunt would have approved of far more than any lawsuit. I kept enough to secure my future and protect the properties she'd built. The rest went into a foundation in Corinne's name, funding small business grants for women starting over the way she once had, quietly, patiently, without needing anyone's permission to matter. Renata called me once, weeks after the divorce was finalized. I almost didn't answer. When I did, her voice sounded smaller than I remembered it, none of the sharpness that used to fill every room she entered. "I owe you an apology," she said. "Yes," I told her. "You do." She was quiet for a moment, then admitted what I'd already known, that the moment she'd heard about the inheritance, she'd thought only about what it might mean for her son's future, never once about mine. "I didn't think about you at all," she said, and something in her honesty surprised me more than the apology itself. I didn't rush to forgive her, and I didn't need to. Forgiveness, I'd learned, wasn't about restoring closeness. It was simply choosing not to carry someone else's mistake as a permanent weight. Nathan and I spoke only once more, on the porch of the house I now owned outright. The week he came to collect the last of his belongings. He stood there a long moment, hands in his coat pockets, looking older than he had the day he'd filed. "I didn't know," he said, "about any of it." "Not really." "I know," I said. That was always the problem. He didn't ask what I meant. Some questions answer themselves once you've stopped needing the response. I don't think about that courtroom with pride. I think about it with something closer to relief. Relief that the truth arrived before I spent another decade being valued by a man who'd only ever loved the version of me he thought he understood. If you've ever had someone decide your worth before truly knowing you, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. And if this reminded you that character reveals itself the moment money enters the room, consider subscribing. There are more stories here about the quiet strength it takes to start again.